Hey everyone, welcome to FF in the Six podcast, episode 8. I'm your host, Anthony Bandu, and our co host, Johnny Shermer, is with us as well. It was a good weekend, I guess, for some of us there in the playoffs. Unfortunately for me, I was eliminated in my league. Johnny, how's it looking for you so far?
It's looking pretty good. I think I'm okay in all three of my leagues so far. I got two wins out of the two leagues I was in the playoffs, and one of them I'm still waiting. But it's looking good for me. It sucks to see that you got eliminated, but that's fantasy for you.
Yeah, it's tough year for me, but I'm looking forward to next year. As in my league, it is a keeper league, so we're keeping two guys. So hopefully, um, you know, throughout the off season, some moves happen with some players, and just more, easier for my guys to get the ball a bit more and things like that, depending on who I select. But we'll head on into it for our Week 14 recap, the starts that we selected. Johnny, you want to go over your guy that you picked for Week 14?
Sure, let's do it. So first off, I did say Deshaun Watson at the Chicago Bears. And last week I was saying the Chicago Bears, they've been so inconsistent as of late with their defense. And this week they looked very, very good. Deshaun Watson only scored 14 points, only one passing touchdown. He was sacked 6 times, did rush for 38 yards. But yeah, he didn't look good. Chicago looked really good. Their offense finally showed up, and that is very nice to see for Montgomery owners, for our Robinson owners. But yeah, it was definitely not Deshaun Watson's week.
Yeah, it was definitely a tough game for him. I was watching a bit of the highlights there, and he was just like very under duress for the game. That D line was definitely getting to him a lot. Sacked 6 times, and it was just weird how sometimes when he goes to throw the ball, he does like a jump pass. I know if it's like for
Yeah.
the
Mm-hmm.
defenders that try to swat the ball down, but I feel like that really messes up his footwork and his accuracy and everything, and it just it's just tough to see him have that rough game against the Chicago Bears, as that was a team that passed on him for Mitchell Trubisky. So, yeah, moving on to the second quarterback we said to sit. I said last week, or to start, sorry, Philip Rivers at the Las Vegas Raiders. He was 19 of 28 attempts, he threw for 244 yards. He had two TDs, scored a total of 20.13 points. Pretty good game for Mr. Philip Rivers there. The old guy can definitely still get it done.
Yeah, he looked good. That was definitely a good start on your behalf. He ended up scoring, like you said, just over 20 points. I know the Raiders aren't great defensively, but the Colts have also been very inconsistent as well on offense this year. So it was good to see Philip do his thing. But moving on to our receivers now. My start, Alan Lazard. I don't even want to talk about this one. 2 receptions, 19 yards, 3.9 points. It looked like Rodgers was obviously going to Devontae Adams and then Valdez Scantling a little more this game rather than Lazard. So that was shitty to see. But, like I said before, it's fantasy. What can you do? Some weeks Lazard has a great week, others he doesn't show up at all. So this was one of those weeks.
Yeah, it was just a very dominant game by Devontae Adams there, and Aaron Jones getting his 15 carries for 69 yards. They're just like doing really well offensively and just not spreading the ball out to the other guys. I mean, Devontae Adams is one of the best wide receivers in the league. So moving on to who I said to start, wide receiver Sterling Shepard. Going against the Arizona Cardinals, he had 3 receptions for 35 yards, scored a total of 6.5 points. Uh, Very sorry for those who started Sterling Shepard. It was very tough to watch my Giants struggle offensively, and I feel like they rushed Daniel Jones into the game as well after seeing some of his throws, and he was very hesitant to run. Just didn't look like the same offense, so maybe they'll bounce back, and Sterling Shepard could be someone that you could rely on if you're still in for the playoffs. But let's move along to the running backs that we set to start.
Yeah, so my start last week on the Thursday night game actually was Cam Akers against the Patriots, and he blew up. So I'm very happy to see that. 29 rushing attempts for 171 yards. Had a couple of receptions in there for 23 yards. Ultimately scored over 21 fantasy points. So I believe they do play the Jets, I want to say, next week for week 15. So you start Akers at all costs, no matter what. It's definitely his backfield now. Henderson hardly saw any touches. I know Brown didn't see much either. So Cam Akers, it's his backfield for the rest of the season.
Yeah, Cam Akers was a absolute stud. Like I had him in our league, and he had a really good game for me. But even with me losing, it's still a bright future for Cam Akers. And if you have him in like a dynasty league, or if you have keeper leagues, and you're thinking about keeping him, definitely keep an eye out for how he does for the last few weeks of the game. But moving on to our second running back we set to start, David Montgomery versus the Houston Texans. 11 carries for 113 yards, 1 TD, 3 receptions for 42 yards, scored a total of 24.5 points. Absolute big game for David Montgomery fantasy owners. And watching that Bears highlights and stuff, the Houston Texans punt the ball to them. First play offensively for the Bears, David Montgomery just takes it to the house for a TD, and you just knew that it was going to be a good game for him after seeing that.
Yeah, I was extremely pumped for that. I ended up benching Chris Carson. I think that's what you told me last week to do. I benched Carson and I started Montgomery in the flex, and it worked out for me. He had 24 points, and obviously he helped me win my week there. But it's great to see him doing well, and I hope he continues doing well for the rest of the season. But moving on to our tight end starts, I can't even really talk about this one. Noah Fant, Denver Broncos. He left very early in the game with a non-COVID-19 related illness. So he didn't end up scoring any points at all. But Anthony, I'll let you move on to your tight end.
Yeah, this one was a big disappointment. Tight end Hayden Hurst of the Atlanta Falcons going against the Los Angeles Chargers. He had 1 reception for 7 yards, scored a total of 1.7 points. Not a good uh, games for our tight ends that we've selected this for last week to start, but hopefully for this week we get it right. But we'll move on to the defense. We said,
Yes, the defense I ended up wanting to start was Tennessee at Jacksonville, and they did what was expected of them. Only allowed 10 points, had an interception as well in there. Just scored over 11 points, so that was very nice to see. Let's move on to our sits. I'm going to start off with my QB, Matt Stafford, against the Green Bay Packers. I think this was a pretty good success for me here. He went 24-34, 244 yards. He did have one passing touchdown in there, but that was about it. He got sacked 4 times, only ended up scoring just over 12 points. So you definitely want something more than that for your quarterbacks, but that was definitely a safe sit option for sure.
yeah, and the quarterback I said to sit, Kyler Murray going against the New York Giants. He was 24-35, 244 yards, 1 TD. He had 13 carries for 47 yards, and he was sacked once. So pretty similar numbers passing like from Matthew Stafford, but with the rushing numbers, adds up his total score. He scored a total of 17.8 points. Pretty good game for Kyler Murray, but there's definitely better options out there as well. So we'll say that this one was a decent play if you did play him. But if you did sit him, hopefully you had someone that uh, scored over that 17 points there.
Yeah, moving on to our wide receivers. I'm gonna get clowned for this one for sure. I was on to a theory here to sit Stephon Diggs. I thought was gonna have a tough comeback game after their first loss of the season, and that was not the case. They have now lost two straight. Diggs went off, 10 receptions, 130 yards, a touchdown in there, scored almost 30 fantasy points. So I'm not going to sit Stephon Diggs ever again. I'm not going to talk about him at all. Anthony, you can talk about him all you want, but I'm never going to say his name again.
Yeah, it was definitely tough to see Stephon Diggs making catch after catch after catch. Um, but it was just unfortunate for the Steelers defense that they had so many injuries on their defense, and like their best cornerback Joe Hayden was out for the game. So that was kind of a big play into how Stephon Diggs kind of just went off against this defense. But if Joe Hayden's healthy, I kind of see it looking forward to the Steelers defense just shutting down like players that are predominantly really good receivers. Like they shut down Terry McLaurin. So it's just tough for us to say to sit Stephon Diggs, and that outcome happens where they have an injury to one of their better players. But moving on to wide receiver Devontae Parker of the Miami Dolphins versus Kansas City Chiefs. He suffered a leg injury in the second quarter and did not return to the game. He didn't score anything or get any of the passes, targets, or anything prior to the injury. So he's definitely a good sit decision there, and just very unfortunate for the injury. Hopefully, he's healthy and able to come back for week 15. And the running backs that we said to sit, Johnny, you want to take care of that first one there?
For sure, yeah. So he's set to sit Houston Texan David Johnson again at the Chicago Bears, and that was obviously a very good sit. He hasn't been doing too hot as of late. Last night he went 8 rushes, 26 yards, had a couple of receptions in there for actually 53 yards, which was nice. He did have a fumble though, only scored 8.4 points, and obviously again you don't want that as a starting running back in your lineup, especially in playoff time. So if you did end up sitting him, that was a very good decision for you.
Yeah, that's definitely a good decision to sit David Johnson, and it was very tough offensively to see the Texans struggle against the Chicago Bears. But moving on to the running back we set to sit. The next one was Kareem Hunt versus the Baltimore Ravens. That game is to be determined just because we are recording before the game. So we'll move on to the tight ends that we said to sit.
Yeah, so starting off Green Bay Packer Rob Tunyon at the Detroit Lions. Had a pretty slow game, honestly. Only 5 receptions, 36 yards, but he did end up having that one touchdown in there. So he did get boosted up to 14.6 points. So that definitely did not help my cause. But other than that touchdown, I would have been safe, but he did end up getting it. But he's been looking very, very solid. So if you don't have a great tight end option, which I know a lot of teams don't, uh, Tunyon's definitely a safe start, most likely for the next week and week 16 as well.
Yeah, I have a love hate relationship with Robert Tunyon just because I had him in fantasy, and the guy that was going against picked him up, started him in their starting tight end spot, and I was hoping that he wouldn't catch TD, and the next thing you know, he does.
Oh.
Definitely very unfortunate. It was definitely a revenge game for Tunyon. I thought he was out to get me. He definitely did. So that guy's going on to moving forward to the next round of the playoffs, while I'm now planning for next year. But we'll move on to the next guy that we set to sit, Tyler Higbee versus the New England Patriots. He had 2 receptions for 34 yards, scored a total of 5.4 points. Definitely a good bench option there. Just now seeing that Cam Akers is now the focal point of the offense with the 29 carries that he just had, and just exploding on the field overall. Just a pretty good option there to sit, and definitely maybe one we'll have to keep an eye out moving forward.
Yeah, 100%. Last but not least, I will mention what defense I said to sit. Didn't work as as I mentioned earlier. Pittsburgh, I thought they were going to have a great game. That didn't end up happening. Buffalo defensively actually had a really good game. Only allowed 15 points, had a sack in there, 2 interceptions, and a pick six. So ended up scoring just over 13 points. And honestly, anything above 10 points for your defense, that's what you love to see, especially in the playoffs.
Yeah, definitely. It was just I, I guess we thought the opposite with the defenses there for Pittsburgh wanting to be the better option there, and then the Buffalo defense to sit. Just things going to work out in our favor, and that pick six was pretty rough to see from Big Ben. But moving on to the injuries, QB of the Detroit Lions, Matthew Stafford, suffered a rib injury. He might be missing the Week 15 matchup. So definitely keep an eye out for that. And Washington football team, Alex Smith suffered a calf injury. Hopefully that he's able to come back for week 15 and it's nothing too serious.
Yeah, moving on. I think Anthony, you mentioned this one wide receiver on the Dolphins, Devontae Parker, did suffer that leg injury, so we're gonna wait and see this week if he ends up practicing or not. Next up, Debu Samuel. I believe he left pretty early as well in that 49ers game. He had a hamstring injury, so we'll see what happens with that. Tight end on the Dolphins, Mike Gesicki, suffered a shoulder injury. He had a very good game. Ended up getting that shoulder injury pretty late in the game. So we'll have to wait and see what happens with that. Next up, Tampa Bay Buccaneers running back Ronald Jones came out today that he may have possibly fractured his pinky last night in the game. Obviously, he should be able to play with that, but it might limit his snap counts, especially if Leonard Fournette comes back. And moving on to more injuries that were released today on the LA Chargers, Austin Eckler, Keenan Allen, and Hunter Henry all did not practice today. It did say that most of them had, so for Eckler, a quad injury, Allen hamstring, Henry hip injury. But that may just be for rest. They do have a Thursday night matchup this week against the Raiders. So again, that might be just for rest. They might actually be injured, but we'll have a better thought on that tomorrow if they do end up practicing or not.
Yeah, it's definitely a big, worry for some people, to see that the running back, star wide receiver, and tight end all on the injury list there with not participating on Monday's practice. But it's just a rest thing, I think, and they'll just be able to rest up for the game on Thursday. We're moving on to our week 15 starts. What a great transition. I'm saying to start Justin Herbert against the Las Vegas Raiders playing this Thursday. And looking at the stats last week versus the Atlanta Falcons, Herbert was 36 of 44, had 243 passing yards, scored 2 TDs through the air. He had 1 interception, scored a total of 17.10 fantasy points, which is all right. He had a great matchup. He has a great matchup going against the Raiders as they've recently just fired their defensive coordinator, Paul Gunther, and promoted Rod Marinelli from the D line coach to the interim defensive coordinator. So, this game being on a short week for this Raiders defense, to turn things around entirely, it's just going to be pretty hard for that Raiders defense to do all that. So it kind of gives me the confidence in Herbert to have a good game like he did in week 8 versus the Raiders. So week 8, we'll look at his numbers. Herbert was 28 of 42. He had 326 passing yards, 2 TDs. He had 5 rushes for 24 yards as well and 1 fumble. He scored a total of 24.27 fantasy points. And the Raiders defense right now have given up the 8th most passing yards this season, as well as 22 touchdowns through the air. So I'm definitely gonna ride with Justin Herbert going against the Raiders. Um, just very good quarterback, even though he is a rookie. And like I said, firing their D coordinator, it's just going to be tough for this defense to turn it around.
Yeah, Herbert has looked so good ever since he got that start in week 2, I believe it was. And the Raiders D has been very questionable, as we saw 1 or 2 weeks ago against the Jets. They almost blew it. But I know Herbert's definitely going to capitalize on that, and he's definitely a very, very good start for week 15. But moving on to my QB start this week, it's going to be Ryan Tannehill against the Detroit Lions. So last week against Jacksonville, only threw for 212 yards, which isn't too much, but he did end up having 2 passing touchdowns, scored just over 20 fantasy points. So this week against Detroit, Detroit averages the 6th most passing yards per game in the league with just over 263. The Titans are fighting for a playoff spot as of right now. So Tannehill will definitely be using his receiving weapons in A.J. Brown and Corey Davis for a lot of the game, as well as Derrick Henry in there. I know Detroit's rushing defense isn't great either, so he's going to most likely have a very, very good week. But Tannehill's been on a roll lately. I think in the past 2 games, he's just over 600 passing yards with 601. And Detroit is one of the worst in the league, averaging at least 2 passing touchdowns per game. So obviously, that's what you want to see in your starting quarterback for week 15. Obviously, you want to see a bunch of touchdowns being thrown, maximize those points to get you to the finals in the playoffs. But Tannehill has only played Detroit once in his career 6 years ago, so you can't really base any stats off that game today. But yeah, we'll wait and see what happens. But I think Ryan Tannehill is definitely a safe start for week 15.
Ryan Tannehill has been absolutely, a great quarterback option for fantasy owners. Very low on the radar to even consider wanting to draft him. And he's just been absolutely balling. And with AJ Brown making that phenomenal one-handed catch last week against Jacksonville, like this team offensively is really good. Ryan Tannehill is definitely that guy that can, boost the overall talent of the team as well. Um, so he's definitely a good option to start against the Lions, like you were saying. But moving on to the running backs that we said start, I'll run with my guy J.K. Dobbins versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. We still to be determined versus the Cleveland Browns as we were recording this before the game, like we said earlier. So the Jacksonville Jaguars defense has been absolutely atrocious at stopping the run. As last week they allowed King Henry to rush for 215 yards and 2 TDs. Overall, Jacksonville has given up the third most rushing yards this season, as well as the ninth most rushing TDs. The last 3 weeks, the Jaguars have given up 601 rushing yards and 4 TDs as well. Last week, versus the Titans, they gave up the 215 yards to Derrick Henry there and the 2 TDs. And week 13 versus the Vikings, they gave up 145 yards. And then week 12, they gave up the 207 yards, to Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. So, over those games, those teams, the Titans were ranked number one in rush yards. The Vikings are ranked number fifth in rushing yards, and the Browns are ranked number six in rush yards. So with that, the Ravens right now are currently ranked second in rushing yards. So with them being ranked so high, like some of these other teams, kind of gives me, that picture of just seeing them run the ball and just absolutely destroying this Jacksonville Jaguars defense on the ground. And Dobbins has slowly taken over the Ravens backfield as he slowly logged majority of the snaps in recent weeks. And even though we don't know the outcome of the game against the Browns, if Dobbins is healthy and all goes well, he's definitely a guy I would want to start for week 15.
Yeah, it's definitely a good start for sure. Like you were mentioning, he's definitely slowly taking over that backfield. I know Mark Ingram, he's pretty much irrelevant in fantasy now. So it's really between Dobbins and Gus Edwards. They both look very, very good as of late. But like you were saying, Dobbins has just looked really, really good. And the Jaguars, like you said, Henry tore him up. It's very easy to tear up that Jaguars defense. So I think with Lamar in there rushing, and yeah, they're just going to get torn apart, I think. And Dobbins is going to have himself a very good week 15. But moving on to my running back start of the week, it's going to be DeAndre Swift against those Titans. So last week against the Green Bay Packers, only ended up having 24 rushing yards, a couple of receptions in there for 26 yards, but did have that rushing touchdown. So he ended up scoring just over 15 fantasy points. Swift has gotten over 40 fantasy points in his last 2 games that he's played. He was out there with an injury for 2 or 3 weeks, I believe. But obviously in the playoffs, you have to ride the hot hand. Swift's snap percentage will continue to rise until the rest of the season. You know, Adrian Peterson and Kerryon Johnson, they haven't been really getting any looks at all, any snaps. So Swift has definitely gotten that backfield in Detroit. The Titans' run defense hasn't been great, averaging around 114 rushing yards per game to opposing running backs. Last game against the Jaguars, James Robinson picked up just over 65 rushing yards with 67 on 12 attempts. And he did also have a touchdown, but they called that back. So that would have got him close to 20 fantasy points. So I'd expect Swift to do the same thing.
Yeah, like Swift would have probably had 2 TDs if Kerryon Johnson did not absolutely vulture the 1 TD that he
Yeah,
scored with his like 2 rush attempts for the three
you're right.
yards.
Yeah.
So like DeAndre Swift is definitely a really good back and someone that you could still play even though he plays for the Detroit Lions. But moving on to the wide receivers that we said start, I'm going to say start Deontay Johnson at the Cincinnati Bengals. Last week at the Buffalo Bills, he was targeted 7 times. He had 4 receptions for 40 yards. He scored a total of 8 points. And, Mike Tomlin said that they can catch the ball or they can get replaced by those who will catch it. That's a quote by him. That's something that he said about addressing the issues that the Steelers receiving group has had with their drops. And it's been tough for Deontay Johnson as he's had 12 drops this year. And he was benched after his second crucial drop in the first half and seeing James Washington score a TD in his place. Like, that could easily have been his touchdown reception, and it would have put him over the top in fantasy numbers. But he was on the bench, so on a year that where Deontay has only had a catch percentage of 61%, he's ranked 147th in the league with that catch percentage. And even though with all that against him, I think this is still a good game in which he should be starting in your lineup against the Bengals, and this will definitely boost his confidence for you for that final game in your playoffs for fantasy football. Week 10, you look at that matchup versus the Bengals. He had 6 receptions for 116 yards, 1 TD. He scored a total of 23.6 fantasy points. The Bengals are definitely not a contending team in the playoffs at all. And the Pittsburgh offense is really good. They have a lot of talent all across the field offensively. So I could definitely see Big Ben trusting Deontay Johnson to get the ball in his hands and make a play, put up those big numbers like he did in week 10. He is a start for week 15.
Yeah, at this point, Pittsburgh's pissed. They wanted to get back in the win column, especially against the Bengals. And like you were saying, Deontay Johnson, he's an extremely talented receiver, but he has had a lot of drops this season. And Tomlin's not afraid to bench you if you keep dropping the ball. So like you were saying, I think it's definitely going to be a comeback game here for Johnson against the Bengals, and it's definitely going to bring his confidence back up. But moving on to my wide receiver start, it's going to be Justin Jefferson on the Minnesota Vikings against the Chicago Bears. So last week against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, he had 8 targets, only 4 receptions for 39 yards. Also did have a 2-point conversion, scored just under 10 points with 9.9, which is probably one of his worst games of the year. Thielen and Jefferson are definitely that core weapon group that Cousins has to use. Besides that running back that they have, I forget his name, Dalvin Cook, I think. But anyways, Chicago's so inconsistent right now that uh, honestly, any Viking would be a safe start, especially being on their home turf for Week 15. Chicago did have a good week last week against the Texans. Don't get me wrong, but it is the Texans. Their season was over a while ago, and now with Fuller out of the lineup, it's pretty easy to stop what they have going. So the Vikings have a fully healthy team going into Week 15. So I'd expect both Thielen and Jefferson to put up pretty solid points this week. Chicago has allowed around 232 passing yards per game, but over the past 3 games, it's raised to 255, and they average around 1.5 passing touchdowns per game against. But again, over those last 3 games, they're second worst in the league, averaging just under 3 passing touchdowns per game with 2.7. With the Jets being number 1, allowing 3 passing touchdowns per game. So honestly, any receiver that's on that Vikings team right now, I say you start them because Chicago is really struggling with that, and you want as many points as possible.
Yeah, this is definitely going to be a huge game for Justin Jefferson again to go against the Chicago Bears. Watching the highlights from when they played earlier this year, week 10, and he had those he wasn't able to score. I think Adam Thielen was the one that scored those 2 TDs that game, but he was very productive with the 8 receptions, 135 yards. So yeah, he's definitely, a big start right there for the Vikings, and he's taken over probably the most, I think, targets on the team over Thielen. I think he just has 1 target over him, but still, like, he's definitely emerged as a star in this league. But moving on to the tight ends to start, Rob Gronkowski, the Hall of Famer at the Atlanta Falcons last week versus the Minnesota Vikings. He had 1 reception for 2 yards and 1 TD. Scored a total of 7.2 points. There was a big Gronk spike there as well. Almost took out Tristan Wirfs' head. If you didn't see it, you definitely got to watch that video. It's pretty funny. The Atlanta Falcons have played better defensively since firing Dan Quinn. I think we've mentioned that on our podcast earlier this year. But however, I cannot see this defense stopping Tom Brady after what he did in the Super Bowl against them back in 2017. Gronk has scored 5 TDs this year, and just seeing how much of a red zone threat he is, I could definitely see him putting up another tut against this Atlanta defense and seeing another big Gronk spike. Atlanta has allowed 73 receptions and 9 TDs to opposing tight ends, which is the third most in the league. So definitely start Rob Gronkowski in your lineup. We're going to see a big Gronk spike against this Atlanta defense that Tom Brady just absolutely abuses.
Yeah, I hope you're right with this one because I know in our league I have him starting it. He didn't have a great game last week, but he did get that touchdown, so it did raise his points a little bit. But I hope he obviously gets more receptions this week. Hopefully that touchdown as well. So I really hope you're right about that one, Anthony. But moving on to my tight end start of the week, it's going to be Eric Ebron against those Cincinnati Bengals. Last week against Buffalo, he did put up 5 targets, only 2 receptions for 30 yards. He also did have a 2-point conversion, ended up scoring 7 points. But Ebron has only scored 7 points or less in fantasy since week 7. Um, I believe it was twice. I think he's only scored 7 points or less. So he's definitely one of the top tight ends right now for targets and receptions, behind Kelsey, Waller, and Engram. Ebron had 6 targets and 2 receptions for 38 yards in the Week 10 game against the Bengals, only putting up 5.8 points. So that was the other game that he only put up 7 or less points since Week 7. So he's definitely been emerging since then. But the Bengals are ranked 4th worst for tight end points allowed this season. And with the Steelers losing 2 straight, like I said before, I think they're going to be pissed. They're going to have a strong comeback game to clinch that playoff spot with a win over the Bengals. Ebron has the third most targets out of any tight end in the league in the last 3 weeks with 27, behind Kelsey and Waller. So obviously, the more targets you have, the more receptions you potentially could have. And that's very key in the playoffs, especially right now, especially in PPR leagues. You want as many of those points as possible. And with those targets comes potential points. So anything helps at this point.
Yeah, Eric Ebron is a stud in the tight end position. Like, he wasn't even on my radar when we were like doing our draft and stuff for the fantasy leagues. He was just like a waiver pickup. I know like for the team that did pick him up in our league, like he was just you know on the waivers, and he's just been a stud for a while now. So he's definitely a good option to start. And going against the Bengals, definitely him and Deontay, they've had their fair share of drops on the offense, but definitely big game for both of them to bounce back. It's a good start in my opinion. Glad we stacked up on that one a bit for week 15. But moving on to the defense, I'm gonna give the starting nod to my New York Giants going against the Cleveland Browns. And looking at last week versus the Arizona Cardinals, I know it was tough. They allowed 26 points and only got 1 sack. They scored a total of 3.04 fantasy points. It was a tough game for the Giants, as the offense had continuously put them in bad situations on the field. Giving up the ball 3 times, and over the past 2 weeks, they've given up only 447 passing yards, as well as 270 rush yards. And this Browns uh, offense over the past 2 weeks have put up 917 yards of total offense, which is really good. But you got to look at who they played against, and it was the Tennessee Titans and Jacksonville Jaguars. The Giants are ranked way ahead of those two teams, as the Giants are ranked eighth against the run, and they're sitting at 18th against the pass. However, the Browns offensively are only ranked 28th in passing in the NFL. So, with Odell out for the remainder of the year, and their only option really is Jarvis Landry, with the receivers, I could see James Bradbury going against him, and them being able to shut him down, and Baker having to work with the other guys that are on the field. Just not enough talent out there at the wide receiver position, and just seeing how they are against the run for the Giants being eighth against the run in the NFL, like I know the Browns are very good at running the ball offensively, but I could just see them just shutting out them for the passing game and just maybe focusing on the run, but it'll just keep them behind. And the Giants are going to be able to come back and get a win against the Browns.
Like I said, I hope you're right with Gronk, but I hope you're wrong with this one because I do have Chubb in 2 out of my 3 leagues, and I hope he tears your Giants up. But like you said, yeah, the Browns have played 2 not so great teams over the past couple of weeks, so That's why their offense has been really killing it. But I know the Giants, they're obviously fighting for that playoff spot behind the Washington football team. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with that. I think that's a prime time game as well on Sunday night. So it's going to be a great game to watch. But let's move on to our sits for week 15. I'll start off with my first quarterback, and it's going to be Taysom Hill on those New Orleans Saints against the KC Chiefs. So last week against Philadelphia, Hill did have his best game passing wise with 291 yards. Did have 2 passing touchdowns in there as well, but did throw an interception, had 33 rushing yards, as well as 1 fumble lost, ultimately scoring 23.9 fantasy points. Again, he did have a decent game against the Eagles, but it wasn't amazing. It's super easy to say that Hill has had a success out of his 4 starts so far as a starting QB on the Saints team. But 3 of those 4 games, it was against the Falcons and the Broncos. So obviously, those are really good matchups for any QB in the league. And obviously, as we saw yesterday, when you put him up against a very talented defensive team like the Eagles, it shows. So next week won't be any easier against the Chiefs. KC allows on average around 230 passing yards per game. But over the last 3 games has been 260. So they're kind of struggling a little bit. But again, Taysom doesn't really throw the ball as much as he likes to run it. So we'll wait and see what happens with that strategy. Again, KC is only allowed on average around 111 rushing yards per game to opponents. So that's going to be with Hill. That's going to be with Kamara. So it's definitely going to be a tough offensive game for the Saints. But again, I think it's going to be a tough call whether you want to start him or not. But it's definitely going to be a safer option to pick up a QB like Jared Goff, who are going up against the New York Jets next week.
Yeah, definitely a good idea to sit Taysom Hill versus the Chiefs. Tua kind of struggled a bit going against this defense and everything. He threw his first interception of his career. And Taysom Hill is more a predominant runner than he is a thrower. So it's definitely going to be a tough game for him going against this Chiefs defense. But we'll look into the next quarterback we say to sit. I'm going to roll with Drew Lock versus the Buffalo Bills. Last week at the Carolina Panthers, he was 21 of 27 for 280 yards. Threw 4 TDs, had 6 rushes for 4 yards. He was sacked once. He fumbled the ball twice, and he lost it once, and then once he recovered it as well. But he scored a total of 31 points. He played lights out against the Carolina Panthers. But going against the Bills, it's definitely going to be a tough matchup. And even with them being ranked 20th in pass defense, you look at their matchup last week against the Steelers, and they looked like a top 5 defense. They held Roethlisberger to 187 passing yards. He had 2 TDs, but he had the 2 interceptions as well, and one was a pick six. And you got to look at their defensive roster as well with Tre'Davious White. He's been able to lock down opposing wide receivers as he's only given up 55% of completions and only 3 TDs on the year. So he'll be locking down Jerry Jeudy, who is Lock's #1 wide receiver.
Yeah, and like you're saying, that's definitely a good sit option for sure. The Bills are definitely hot right now, coming off of a huge win against the Steelers. So it's going to be interesting to see how the Broncos switch up that strategy on offense. But most likely, it's definitely a safer sit for sure for Drew Lock. But moving on to our running back sits of the week. This is a tough one for me to say, but it's going to be Ezekiel Elliott against the San Francisco 49ers. So last week against the Bengals, Elliott had 12 rushing attempts for only 48 yards, had 2 receptions for 11 yards, only scored 7.9 fantasy points. So I think I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. Zeke really has not been the same ever since Dak went down in week 5 with that gruesome ankle injury. But over the last 3 weeks, Zeke has only put up just over 24 fantasy points. And you really do not want to see that, most likely because you spent a top 5 draft pick on him. But that definitely relates to his target numbers, which drastically went down in week 6 to right to now. I think he averaged around 7 or 8 targets from weeks 1 to 5, and now he really only gets around 3 to 4. So that definitely hurts his point production. The Cowboys do have a very, very tough rest of the season with the 49ers this week, and then a tough Philadelphia Eagles defense in week 16. So the 49ers have only allowed around 105 rushing yards per game, and one of the best in the league with only 0.6 rushing TDs per game allowed. So it's definitely gonna hurt Ezekiel Elliott for sure, and it's definitely a safer option to keep him on the bench.
Yeah, and it's just unfortunate, like, with their O line, they're not healthy at all. They don't have the same guys that they've had uh in years that past with Ezekiel Elliott, rushing the ball and him getting all those rushing numbers, all those TDs and stuff. And Zeke isn't really a receiving option out of the backfield. They got Tony Pollard there as well that takes the opportunities from him in the passing game. So it's just tough to start Zeke as a starting running back for your fantasy lineup there, as he's just mainly relying on his rushing attempts. But when he doesn't get it, then it's just like, what else do you do with him? So on the offense, so it's just tough. So he's definitely a good option there that you said to sit. But moving on to the next guy that we said to sit, I'll be going with Clyde Edwards-Helaire going against the New Orleans Saints in New Orleans last week at the Miami Dolphins. He had 16 rush attempts for 32 yards and only 5 receptions for 59 yards. Scored a total of 14.6 fantasy points. Pretty decent numbers, if you ask me. But going against the New Orleans Saints, I'm not looking forward to that matchup, as Clyde has really slowed down offensively ever since Le'Veon Bell has entered the picture in week 7. From week 7 onward, he has only rushed the ball 60 times for 219 yards and 3 TDs, as well as only having 21 targets, but making 14 of those targets. He only caught 14 of those targets for 116 yards and 1 TD. He's been able to find the end zone at times. However, this with the Chiefs able to score at will through the air on like deep passes. We see Mahomes throwing to Tyreek everywhere, and he gets the ball to Kelsey, but it's just tough to see Clyde Edwards-Helaire not living up to his potential as fantasy owners had thought he would have had earlier this season. Like the Saints, as always, they're ranked number 1 against the run in the NFL, and they've only allowed an average of 13 points to opposing running backs. They've given up only 5 TDs on the ground, and through the air, they've only allowed 2 to the opposing running backs. So, given those numbers and the offense that the Chiefs run, I'm just gonna say, sit Hilaire for Week 15 against the New Orleans Saints.
Yeah, it's definitely a safe sit option for sure. I know Miles Sanders really tore up that Saints D last night, but again, Clyde has really slowed down, which really sucks again because most people did use that first round pick on him. So it really sucks to see him not put up those points that we're hoping to see him put up. But again, the Saints obviously are extremely tough to run against, so it's definitely safer to keep him on the bench. But moving on to our wide receiver sits. This is another tough one for me to say. It's going to be Cole Beasley against the Denver Broncos last week against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Did have 10 targets, but only 5 receptions for 41 yards, scored just over 9 points with 9.1. And I think a lot of us really underestimated Beasley at the beginning of this season with Stephon Diggs coming into that Bills offense. And surprisingly, Beasley rarely scores under 10 points a week. Although Diggs does get 10 plus targets a week, Beasley usually rings in around at least 8 per week. So it clearly puts a huge strain on opposing defenses. Obviously, if Diggs is covered, Allen can throw to Beasley. If Beasley's covered, vice versa. But and that being said, Beasley and the Bills have 2 tough remaining games against the Broncos and Patriots. Obviously, when I say the Broncos, you don't really think it's a tough matchup, but surprisingly, they are 6th best for opposing wide receiver points against. They average just around 220 passing yards per game and only 1.2 passing touchdowns per game against. So that puts them at 2nd best in the league, which really surprised me when I was looking this up. But if you're feeling lucky that Beasley's going to get that touchdown for you, go ahead and start him. But if you have another option, I'd say keep him on the bench.
I am surprised you're saying to bench my boy Cole Beasley against the Denver
I know that was going
Broncos.
to hurt you, but
Yeah, that kind of hurts a bit, but you know, um, yeah, I could definitely see like the numbers that you're saying there for the Broncos defense definitely surprised me as well. I did not even think that they were that good defensively, to shutting down wide receivers. But you know, kudos to you. It's a very good research that you're doing there. Very surprising. But we'll move on to the next guy that we say to bench. Christian Kirk versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Last week at the New York Giants, he had 3 receptions for 14 yards, scored a total of 4.4 fantasy points. Christian Kirk hasn't been able to put up big numbers the last 5 weeks, and it's definitely been disappointing for fantasy owners. He's someone you should definitely bench as they will be playing the Philadelphia Eagles. And with Kenyon Drake back and healthy for the Cardinals, they seem to be more balanced offensively with running the ball and passing as opposed to dominantly throwing the ball all around the yard there, as some people have thought with Cliff Kingsbury offense. Over the past 3 weeks, the Cardinals thrown the ball 108 times and have run the ball 98 times. When Kirk and the overall offense was at its best, you got to look at who they were playing, which is the worst pass defenses in the league. I believe it was like Seattle, Dallas, and one other team. It was the Jets, of course. Yeah. So going against those 3 teams, it was just definitely big production numbers for Kirk. And he's just seeing that. And now that they're going against, better secondaries, I just think Kirk should just sit on your bench going up against the Philadelphia Eagles.
Yeah, like I saw yesterday with my Saints going up against the Eagles, it was definitely tough going against that Eagles defense. So obviously, Christian Kirk not being that number one receiver on the Cardinals, it's definitely going to be tough for him to put up points. And again, against those Giants, he didn't really do anything. So it's definitely safer to keep him on the bench. But moving on to our tight end sits of the week, I'm going to say Hunter Henry versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Last week against the Atlanta Falcons, he did have 8 targets for 6 receptions and 41 yards. He scored just over 10 points. But Henry has done pretty well over the course of the season, being in the top 5 tight ends in the league. The Chargers did play the Raiders in week 9 with Henry having only 4 receptions and 33 yards. And as questionable as the Raiders defense is, they do rank 11th best for tight end points against, but only 19th for wide receiver points against. So, and that being said, I think the Raiders, um, obviously they're better for tight end coverage. So I think the Chargers are going to use those wide receivers and Keenan Allen and Mike Williams if they're both healthy, obviously, and as well as Austin Eckler. So again, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with that injury report if they do end up practicing Tuesday, Wednesday. So we'll have to keep an eye out on that. But again, I think with the Raiders being one of the better teams in the league for tight end coverage, it's safer to keep him on the bench and going with another option.
Yeah, it's definitely a good option to bench him, seeing as the Raiders defense are ranked 11th best in the league against the tight end position. But also too, like Herbert just really focuses on Keenan Allen. And with Eckler back, it's easy for him to just dunk it down to him as a check down. So definitely a good idea to sit Hunter Henry versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Moving on to the next tight end, we said sit Irv Smith Jr. versus the Chicago Bears. Last week at Tampa Bay, Irv Smith had 4 receptions for 63 yards and 1 TD, scored a total of 16.3 fantasy points. Irv Smith Jr. has been very inconsistent all year as he's had multiple games without scoring anything, and then games where he just barely puts up 5 points. Only targeted 27 times this year, and I believe he's 10 targets behind Kyle Rudolph as well. So, with the obvious 2 studs of Jefferson and Thielen, he's just very non-existent in the passing game. So he's definitely someone that you could definitely sit going against the Chicago Bears for Week 15.
Yeah, I don't know what it is with those Vikings tight ends, but Kirk doesn't really seem to like to throw it to them. Obviously, having Jefferson and Thielen definitely helps in the receiving game, but again, with those tight ends, they kind of don't really exist in that offense, so it's definitely safer to keep them on the bench. But moving on, last but not least, our defense sit of the week. It's going to be the New Orleans Saints against the Kansas City Chiefs. This is pretty self-explanatory. I know, obviously, the Chiefs' best offensive team in the league last week against the Philadelphia Eagles for the Saints, 24 points allowed. Did have a fumble recovery, but only ended up scoring 3.6 points. So I don't think it's going to be too much higher than that. Obviously, against the Chiefs, they can do anything at will. So it's going to be an extremely close game, but I think it's definitely safer to stream a defense on the waiver wire this week rather than playing the Saints.
Yeah, definitely a safe bet there for anybody, any defense that really goes against the Chiefs. But, that wraps up our episode 8 of the FF in the Six podcast. Thank you all for listening. And, we've been pretty happy with starting this up and how we've been doing so far. Hopefully, we've gotten you guys, into the playoffs and you guys have been successful. Just always tweet at the show as well on our social media pages. We're definitely always happy to respond. You could always hit us up on Twitter at FF in the Six. And give us a follow on Instagram as well. We're and you can definitely download our podcast on Spotify, and give us a look on YouTube as well, and hit the subscribe button. We definitely want to rack those up before the season ends. So thank you all for listening, and good luck for week 15 in your fantasy playoffs.